Hilda remembered the exact shade of the light, amber and thin, the way it looked in late autumn when the days had already given up trying. She had been 22 years old and foolish enough to believe that showing up was the hardest part. She had braided her hair twice that morning, because the first attempt had not felt serious enough for what the day required. She had pressed her only decent dress until the wrinkles surrendered. She had walked the 12 miles from her village to the capital without complaint, arriving with mud on her boots and a steadiness in her chest that she mistook, at the time, for courage. The marking ritual was held in the throne room of Aldenmere Palace, a space so vast that the ceiling disappeared into shadow even at midday. Stone columns rose on either side of the central aisle, carved with the histories of every pack that had bent the knee to the king's line. Hundreds of people filled the gallery above, nobles, counselors, representatives of every major pack in the kingdom, arranged in tiers of importance that Hilda had not yet learned to read. She had known, walking in, that she did not belong among the women at the front. The others presented that day were daughters of pack leaders, of landholders, of families whose names appeared on official documents. They wore silk. They had attendants. They stood with the particular ease of people who had never once doubted their right to occupy a room. Hilda had stood near the back and waited. When her name was called, she walked forward. She did not see the wolf move in his eyes. She learned about that later, from a kitchen servant who had been watching from the side passage and told the story for years afterward as though it belonged to her. What Hilda saw was the king himself. Tall, composed, his dark beard trimmed close, his blue eyes moving across her face with an expression she could not name. Something shifted in his posture. His shoulders dropped a fraction. His jaw tightened. Then the man at his left shoulder leaned in. Aldous. She did not know his name yet either. He was silver-haired, thin, with the careful stillness of someone who had spent decades learning to look harmless. He spoke into the king's ear for no more than 4 seconds. The king's expression closed, like a door. "No," he said. One word. Not loud, not cruel in its delivery, which almost made it worse because there was no heat in it, no conflict, nothing to suggest the decision had cost him anything at all. He had already moved on before the sound finished, traveling across the stone floor. Hilda walked back down the aisle. She remembered that walk more clearly than anything else about that day, the way her footsteps sounded against the stone. The way she kept her chin level, not out of pride exactly, but because lowering it would have meant she was falling, and she had not fallen yet. She did not fall until she was outside, past the iron gate, halfway down the road, where there was no one left to watch. She did not know then about the woman in the upper gallery who had watched her go. Lady Seraphine had been 19 that year, still learning to carry herself with the full weight of what her family had built. She had stood at the carved railing above the throne room floor, her green eyes following Hilda's retreat down the aisle with an attention she had been careful not to let anyone notice. When the doors closed behind the rejected Omega, Seraphine had exhaled once, slowly, and returned her gaze to the ritual as though nothing of interest had occurred. Her family's work had held. That was what mattered. 10 years changed the weight of things without changing their shape. Hilda was 32 now, and the palace linen stores were her domain in the way that forgotten rooms belong to the people assigned to maintain them, completely and without prestige. She knew every shelf, every cabinet, every moth-eaten corner that required attention before the winter rounds. She could tell by touch which bolts of cloth had been mended and which were still waiting. She had found, over the years, a certain satisfaction in work that asked nothing of her except competence. The pack servants left her alone, not out of kindness, out of habit. She had been there long enough that her presence no longer registered as notable. She ate at the far end of the kitchen table, completed her rounds before the household woke, and returned her supplies without requiring supervision. She was 32 years old and had, through sustained effort, become the kind of person that rooms forgot. She had told herself for a long time that she preferred it that way. Then the announcement reached the lower halls. It came by way of the laundry women first, the way most palace news did, carried in pieces and reassembled inaccurately by the time it arrived at the lower passages. The Alpha King would perform the grand marking ritual before the winter solstice. Every pack lord of standing had been summoned to the capital to witness. Lady Seraphine of House Vane would stand at the ritual stone. Hilda heard it and went back to counting linens. What followed was 3 weeks of preparation that turned the palace into something barely recognizable. Extra staff arrived from the outer territories. The Great Hall was emptied and redressed. Stone floors that had not been polished in years were polished. Tapestries were beaten outside in the cold morning air until they stopped releasing dust. The whole building seemed to hold its breath and then release it in the form of organized frenzy. Hilda was assigned to the ritual preparations on the 4th day. Specifically, the ceremonial linens, the altar cloth, the arrangement of the candle stands flanking the marking stone. It was detailed work, and she was known to be reliable. No one considered whether she might find it difficult. She did not allow herself to find it difficult. She was measuring the altar cloth against the stone on her 2nd morning of preparations when Seraphine arrived for the spacing inspection. The lady moved through the great hall with 3 attendants trailing her, pausing at intervals to examine the arrangements with a precise eye and a word of correction for anything that did not meet her standard. She did not rush. She was not the sort of woman who rushed. Hilda kept her attention on the cloth and her hands on the measurement cord. She heard the footsteps slow. "You," Seraphine said. The word was not loud. It was the tone that lifted Hilda's head, precise and controlled, like a blade placed carefully rather than swung. She found Seraphine standing 4 feet away, green eyes moving across her face with an expression that resolved, after a moment, into something resembling careful neutrality. "My lady," Hilda said. Seraphine looked at her for 3 full seconds without speaking. Then her gaze moved to the altar cloth, and she offered one small suggestion about the alignment of the eastern edge, and she walked on. Nothing in her manner indicated that anything of significance had passed between them. But Hilda had been living in close quarters with other shifters for 10 years, and her senses, stripped of almost everything else, had remained sharp whether she wanted them to or not. What reached her in those 3 seconds was not hostility, not the mild contempt a noblewoman might carry toward a servant who had once brushed too close to her world. It was something older and more structural than contempt, something that had been maintained deliberately, buried under layers of composure that had taken years to construct. Fear. Seraphine of House Vane, who was 11 days from becoming queen of every pack in the kingdom, was afraid of a woman measuring cloth in the great hall. Hilda set down the measurement cord. She looked at the altar cloth. She thought about the way the lady's eyes had moved across her face. Not dismissive, not merely cataloging a servant. Tracking. The way a person looked at something they had been watching for a long time and had finally confirmed the location of. She picked up the cord again and finished the measurement. She had no framework for what the fear meant. No reason, in any arrangement of facts available to her, to believe herself a threat to a woman like Seraphine. She was a linen worker in the Lower East Passage. She was the Spinster Omega, which was what the court called her when they remembered she existed at all. She had been turned away from the only ritual that might have altered the course of her life, and she had survived it by making herself quieter and more useful than anyone who might otherwise have found reason to remove her from the only roof she had access to. She was not a threat to anyone, and yet Seraphine's scent had carried that cold, buried thing beneath all its careful composure, and Hilda's wolf, dormant for so long it sometimes felt like a story she had told about someone else, had recognized it without being asked. She finished the altar measurements and rolled the cord and walked back to the storage corridor. The question stayed with her through the afternoon rounds, through the evening inventory, through the cold quiet of her room where the walls were stone and the single window faced the stable yard. The ritual was in 11 days. Seraphine was afraid of something. Hilda, who had spent 10 years learning to ask nothing and expect less, found that she could not stop turning it over. Not because she planned to act on it. Not because she had any reason to believe it connected to her in a way that mattered. Only because she was, beneath everything the years had made of her, still the woman who had walked down that aisle with her chin up. And that woman had always needed to understand the rooms she was not supposed to be in. She blew out the candle and lay in the dark and listened to the palace settle into silence around her. 11 days. The morning of the ritual arrived with the kind of stillness that precedes things that cannot be undone. Hilda carried the last of the ceremonial candles into the great hall before the household had fully woken setting each one into its iron stand with the care the occasion required. The altar cloth lay perfectly aligned. She had checked it twice the night before and once more at dawn, because precise work was the only form of control available to her, and she had learned not to waste it. By the time the first attendants arrived to begin the final preparations, she had retreated to her position along the far wall, among the other servants designated to remain present through the ceremony. She was not supposed to have a clear view of the marking stone. She had one anyway. The hall filled over the course of 2 hours. Pack lords arrived with their retinues, filling the tiered gallery above with the accumulated authority of every major territory in the kingdom. She could feel the weight of them, the particular pressure that gathered in spaces occupied by too many alphas at once, something between sound and sensation that sat at the base of the skull and did not leave. The lower hall filled with lesser-ranked attendants, witnesses, servants who would remain standing along the walls until it was over. Seraphine entered from the eastern corridor at the appointed hour. She was composed in the way that marble was composed, structured all the way through, with nothing soft underneath. Her attendants arranged themselves behind her. She took her position before the marking stone without glancing at the gallery, without acknowledging the assembled lords, with the particular stillness of someone who had rehearsed her own transformation into a queen so many times that the performance had become indistinguishable from the truth. She did not look toward the far wall. Hilda watched her and thought about the fear she had scented 11 days ago and what it meant that Seraphine showed none of it now. The Alpha King entered through the main doors. The hall went quiet in the way it only did for him. Not silence imposed by protocol, but the kind that happened naturally when something with that much authority moved through a space. Edric walked the central aisle with the measured pace of a man who had done this enough times to know that nothing required speed. He was in formal dress, darker than his usual colors, and the close-trimmed beard and the scar along his jaw made him look less like a king performing a ceremony, and more like a soldier who had been asked to stand still for one. His wolf was already unsettled. Hilda felt it before she understood what she was feeling. A shift in the pressure of the room, something moving beneath the formal surface of the procession. She had been around enough high-ranking shifters over the years to recognize the particular quality of a wolf straining against its human container, and what she felt now was not subtle. It moved through the hall like a current beneath still water, slow and then not slow. She pressed her back against the wall and said nothing. Edric continued down the aisle. He was 12 feet from the marking stone when the current sharpened. 8 feet. He kept walking. His expression did not change. His stride did not change. And then, 3 steps from Seraphine, everything changed. He stopped. The halt was so complete it seemed to affect the air around him. His head turned, not toward the stone, not toward Seraphine, not toward the gallery, toward the far wall, toward the collection of servants standing in their designated positions along the stone, toward Hilda. The silence in the hall took on a different quality entirely. Edric crossed the distance between them in the time it took the assembled lords to understand what they were seeing. He moved through the gathered witnesses without touching anyone, without speaking, as though the other bodies in the room were obstacles he was navigating with the patience of a man operating below conscious thought. Hilda's first instinct was to step back. She had nowhere to step. The wall was directly behind her. He stopped in front of her. She had not been this close to him since she was 22 years old and standing at the front of a different ritual. He was larger than memory had rendered him, and the blue of his eyes was darker at close range, and there was something moving behind them that was not entirely him. She had time to think with absolute clarity. He does not recognize me. Then his head dropped to her neck, and his teeth broke skin, and the world fractured. The pain was brief and specific, less than she had imagined, and nothing like she would have described if asked. What followed the pain was worse, because it was not pain at all. It was the sensation of something closing, a mechanism long broken, finally engaging. A weight settled through her chest and down into her bones that felt, horribly and precisely, like arriving somewhere she had never been, but that her body had always known. She heard the hall erupt around her, as though from a considerable distance. The mark burned where his teeth had been. She reached up and pressed her palm against her own neck and felt the heat of it beneath her fingers, and thought, with the cold fury of a woman who had been managing on her own terms for 10 years. Absolutely not. Her wolf woke up. It came back the way something returns when it has been locked in a dark room for too long, disoriented, furious, bigger than the space it had been given. It slammed against the inside of her ribs, and she bore down against it with everything she had, because this was not the moment and this was not the place, and she would not give this room, these lords, this king, the satisfaction of watching her lose herself. She held. Edric had stepped back. He was looking at her with an expression she could not fully read, something pulled apart and reassembled incorrectly. Like a man trying to understand a language he had been told he did not speak. He did not recognize her. She could see it plainly. He had crossed a room full of witnesses and marked a servant against a wall, and he did not yet know who she was. She knew exactly who he was. "Remove it," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was disproportionately grateful for that. His brow drew together. Remove the mark." She kept her hand against her neck and her eyes on his face, and her wolf pressed behind every wall she had built over years of practice. "You have made an error. Correct it." He opened his mouth, closed it. The expression on his face moved through several things she had no names for. Behind him, the hall was in motion. She could hear Aldous' voice rising above the chaos, measured and authoritative, already working to contain what had just been made public. She could hear the gallery above beginning to splinter into argument, the sound of lords speaking over one another with the particular urgency of men whose political calculations had just been made irrelevant. She could not see Seraphine from where she stood, but she did not need to. She could feel the cold weight of calculated attention from somewhere to her left, steady and deliberate in a room full of people losing their composure. Edric said, "Come with me. Answer my question first." "I cannot answer it here. Can you remove it or not?" Something shifted in his jaw. "I don't know." She stared at him. The mark at her neck pulsed once, with a heat that had nothing to do with the wound, and everything to do with the wolf now pacing behind her sternum like something relearning the dimensions of its own cage. "Then," she said, "find out." They put her in a room in the eastern residential corridor, not a servant's room, which would have been appropriate, and not a proper guest chamber, which would have required a decision no one had made yet. Something between the two. A bed with real linens, a fireplace already lit, 2 candles on the side table. Someone had moved quickly and without clear instruction and done the thing that seemed least wrong under the circumstances. Hilda sat on the edge of the bed and touched nothing. She pressed her fingers to her neck again. The mark had stopped burning. It sat under her skin now like something that had settled in for a long stay. And every few minutes her wolf pressed against it from the inside like testing the latch on a door it had not known existed an hour ago. She had spent 10 years building distance from the life she had once imagined she might have. She had done it methodically, without ceremony, because grieving a future required first believing one had been owed to her, and she had made her peace with not believing that. She had reduced her world to what was manageable and maintained it there through force of habit and a refusal to look directly at certain things. In the space of 20 minutes, someone had marked her in front of every pack lord in the kingdom. There was a knock at the door. She did not answer it. After a moment, Edric opened it anyway and stood in the doorway with the manner of a man who had been king long enough that rooms tended to open regardless of what their occupants preferred. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me a removal," Hilda said. "Save the explanation for after." He came in. He did not sit. He stood near the fireplace with the same contained quality he had carried down the aisle. Except the performance had come apart, and underneath it was a man who did not have a prepared answer for what she had asked him. "The court scholars are being consulted," he said. "There are precedents for incomplete rituals, for contested markings. I have sent for every relevant record in the palace archive. That is not a yes." "No," he said, "it is not." She looked at him. He had not placed her yet. 10 years ago, he had not bothered to learn the rejected Omega's name. She had been a complication resolved, nothing more. She could see him trying, the way his eyes moved across her face, and found nothing that matched any category of memory he had been keeping. She was a servant he had never individually noticed, from the perspective of the man who had spent 10 years not noticing her. From the perspective of the woman she actually was, he was the person who had taken the one moment that might have changed the direction of her life and ended it with a single word before walking on. She was not going to tell him that tonight. "You will inform me," she said, "the moment your scholars have anything conclusive." "Yes, and until then, I remain in this room, under no obligation to anyone in this palace. It would be advisable." "I am not asking for your advisement," Hilda said. "I am stating my terms." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression that she might have called respect in a different context, involving entirely different people. "Your terms," he said, "are noted." He left. Hilda lay back on the bed without removing her boots and stared at the ceiling and felt her wolf circling something deep in her chest. An animal that had been given, against all reasonable expectation, a reason to stir. It had not yet decided whether that was something to reach toward or something to resist. She suspected, in the way she suspected most things she was not ready to examine directly, that it was going to take considerably longer than one night to find out. 3 days after the ritual, they moved her belongings without asking. She returned from the morning rounds to find her room in the lower east passage emptied with the same impersonal efficiency that the palace applied to all logistical problems, completely and without particular feeling. Her spare dress, her worn boots, the small tin box where she kept the things she had accumulated over a decade of careful living. All of it relocated to a chamber in the eastern residential corridor, 2 doors down from the room where she had spent the first night. This one had a window that faced the gardens. The bed was twice the width of her old one. There was a writing desk and a wardrobe with brass fittings and a rug on the floor that had cost more than she would earn in 3 years. She left the wardrobe empty and kept her belongings in the tin box on the desk. A servant arrived the first morning with a breakfast tray that included things she had never eaten at the palace. Poached eggs, a full portion of bread that had not been portioned down from yesterday's loaf, a small jar of honey. She thanked the servant and ate the bread and left the rest. When the servant returned for the tray and found it largely untouched, she said nothing and did not return with the honey the following morning. Hilda continued to report to the linen stores each day. No one had told her she could not. No one had told her anything officially. That was the nature of her current situation, which occupied a space in the palace hierarchy for which no existing category was adequate. She was not a prisoner. She was not a guest. She was not a noble, and she was not, in any sense the court recognized, a queen. She was a woman with a mark on her neck that the palace scholars had spent 3 days consulting records about, without, as far as she had been told, reaching any conclusion. She had asked Edric on the second morning. He had come to the door of the chamber. He knocked, she noticed, and waited to be acknowledged before entering, and stood near the window with his hands clasped behind his back, and told her that the records were extensive, and the scholars were thorough, and that he expected clarity within the week. "That is the same answer you gave me yesterday," she said. "The situation has not changed since yesterday." "Then stop coming to tell me it has not changed." She had turned back to the writing desk, where she had been cataloging the linen inventory she had carried up from the stores, out of the need to do something with her hands. "When there is something to report, report it. Until then, I would prefer not to be visited with updates about the absence of updates." He had left, without argument. She had sat at the desk and pressed her palm flat against the wood and waited for the peculiar sensation in her chest to subside. The mark warming whenever he was in the room, her wolf lifting its head toward something she had not given it permission to reach toward. On the 4th day, something changed in how he looked at her. He had come with an actual piece of information that time. One of the scholars had located a partial precedent involving an interrupted ritual from 2 generations back, which was promising but not conclusive, and she had been standing at the window when he entered. The morning light was coming in at an angle that caught the red in her hair. She did not know that. She only knew that he stopped speaking mid-sentence, and when she turned to look at him, the expression on his face was no longer the one he had been wearing for 4 days. It was recognition, not the surface kind, not the quick adjustment of a man realizing he had misremembered a name. This was the slower, more damaging kind, the kind that arrived like water finding cracks, filling spaces that had been sealed shut, spreading to corners that had been carefully kept dry. She watched it happen across his face and felt, with a clarity she had not expected, completely nothing, which was not the same as feeling nothing. It was the specific sensation of having prepared over a long period for a particular kind of impact. He said her name. He said it differently than he had said it over the past 4 days, not as the designation of a person whose situation required managing, but as a word that had suddenly acquired a history. Hilda, he said. You were at the ritual 10 years ago. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a long time. She returned her attention to the window and did not help him with whatever he was working through. She had spent 10 years working through it alone. He could manage 4 minutes. On the 5th day, Seraphine moved. Hilda learned about it the way she learned most things, not from official communication, but from the quality of tension in the palace corridors in the morning, which changed in specific ways depending on the nature of the problem. This particular change had the density of something political, with an undercurrent of urgency that the serving staff carried in their posture without realizing they were carrying it. By midday, she knew the shape of it. Documents had been presented to the council. A formal accusation of espionage, constructed with reference to communications, allegedly exchanged between Hilda and a pack lord from the Northern Territories with whom the crown had a contested border dispute. The documents were specific. Dates, a location in the lower city where the exchanges had supposedly occurred, a description of the information allegedly passed. They were also, as far as Hilda could determine, entirely fabricated. She had never been to the lower city. She had not left the palace grounds in 8 months. She did not know the name of the northern pack lord the documents referenced, and she doubted anyone in this building could find a single person who had ever seen her in any context that resembled the one described. She was a linen worker. Her daily movements were more predictable and more easily verified than almost anyone else in the palace. None of that made the accusation less dangerous. Aldous had moved to request her formal detention before the council, pending review. Edric had dismissed the request, not with explanation, but with the flat authority of a king who did not require one. The dismissal held, but the argument had not ended with it. She could feel the tension of it in the corridors, in the way certain servants moved past her room more quickly than they had the day before. She sat with it for the length of one afternoon and then decided she was not going to wait. The Royal Archive occupied the northern wing of the palace's second level, behind a set of doors that required a key held only by the head archivist and the king's personal secretary. Hilda did not have a key. She did have, after 5 days of navigating the palace's revised attitude toward her movements, a reasonable understanding of when the archive doors were propped open for ventilation, which was every afternoon when the natural light was strongest, between the 2nd and 4th bells. She arrived at the 3rd bell and walked in. Osric was at the long central table with 3 open volumes and the expression of a man who had been in the middle of something for several hours and expected to remain in the middle of it for several more. He was around 50, with the gray-brown coloring of someone who spent most of their time indoors. And he looked up at her entrance with neither alarm nor particular welcome. "You need something," he said. It was not a question. "I need to look at land title records from the Aldenmere founding period," she said, "and anything related to lineage registries from the same era." He studied her for a moment. His eyes moved to the mark on her neck and then back to her face, with the practiced neutrality of someone who had spent decades learning not to let their expression comment on things. "Founding period is the northern stack," he said. "3rd row from the back, bottom 3 shelves. The older registry volumes are indexed on the inside cover. You know how to handle archival paper?" "Yes." "Then you don't need me to show you." She went to the northern stack. It took the better part of 2 hours. The records from the founding period were organized by territorial designation rather than family name, which meant she had to work backward from the land title reference she had found in the fragment. The partial name of her mother's family, a phrase attached to a grant of land in the Eastern Hill Territories that had been absorbed into the Crown holdings several generations back. The absorption was documented. The grant itself was harder to trace. She found Osric at her elbow at some point during the 2nd hour, adding volumes to her working stack without commentary. She did not ask him why he was helping her. He did not explain. What she found eventually was incomplete, but legible. The family name on the founding period grant matched the partial name from the fragment. The grant itself cited the family's lineage designation, a designation that connected, through 2 generations of record, to one of the original founding houses of the kingdom, not a minor one. She sat with it for a long moment. "You knew this was here," she said. Osric, who had returned to his own table, turned a page in one of his volumes. "I know what is in every record in this archive. That is the function of an archivist." "But you did not tell anyone." "No one asked." He paused. "Until now." She looked at the documents in front of her and thought about what they meant and what it would take to make them mean anything to anyone else. And she felt the weight of the distance between a fragment in an archive and a provable claim with a steadiness that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with habit. She pulled out a second volume that Osric had added to her stack without comment. It contained consolidated references to the kingdom's oldest legal instruments, the foundational rights retained by Pax citizens regardless of political circumstance. Near the middle, she found what appeared to be the open judgment laws, the right of any formally accused citizen to demand public questioning before all alpha witnesses currently assembled in the capital. She read the relevant passage 3 times. Seraphine's accusation had been formally entered before the council. It had been dismissed, but it had been entered. Whether that constituted the trigger for this right was a question she could not answer from the text alone. She made a careful notation of the volume and the page and set it aside, separate from the land title documents. "This passage," she said to Osric, pointing to the relevant section without touching the page. "Has it been invoked in living memory?" "Not in mine," he said. "Twice in the records, both before my predecessor's tenure." "Did it hold?" "Both times." She closed the volume carefully and aligned it with the others and sat at the table for a moment longer, looking at nothing in particular, letting the silence of the archives settle around her. Her wolf had been restless for days. She had attributed it to the proximity of the mark, to the intrusive awareness of Edric's presence in the palace, to the general disruption of everything she had spent years organizing into stability. But sitting in the archive with the smell of old paper and the sound of Osric turning pages, she felt it settle fractionally, not satisfied, but directed. The way an animal moved differently when it had identified which direction the threat was coming from. She began to understand that waiting had a limit. That night she woke at the 3rd hour, abruptly, from a sleep that had not been troubled by anything she could name. The room was dark. The fire had burned down to coals. She lay on her back and breathed and felt it. The thing that had become familiar over 5 nights in this room, and no less unwelcome for its familiarity. Edric's state, arriving through the bond like weather coming under a door. Not words, not images. The raw material of it. Restlessness. The particular weight of something that had been turned over too many times without resolution. And underneath that, faint and layered, something that she recognized despite herself as guilt. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum and told her wolf to settle. Her wolf declined. She stared at the ceiling until the coals faded to gray and thought about an archive entry, a land title, a law that had not been invoked in longer than anyone currently living could remember. She thought about Seraphine's face in the great hall, composed past the point where composure was natural, controlled past the point where control was easy. She thought about a woman who had been afraid of a servant measuring cloth, and what it meant that the fear had preceded everything Hilda herself had known. Someone had known first, and they had worked, carefully and over a very long time, to ensure that it never mattered. She had found 2 tools in the archive today. She did not know yet which one she would need, or in what order, or whether either of them would be enough when the time came. What she knew was that she was done waiting to find out. The task arrived as written orders, which was unusual. Hilda received most of her assignments through the head of the domestic staff, or through the assistant who managed the residential corridor. Verbal instructions, passed down through the hierarchy that governed daily life in the palace. Written orders were for formal arrangements, for transfers of staff between departments, for situations that required documentation. The note slipped under her door on the 18th night after the ritual was brief and carried the palace steward's seal. A shipment of winter linens had arrived at the outer stables from the eastern territories. Given the hour and the size of the delivery, it required immediate cataloging to prevent damage from cold exposure. Her presence was requested. She read it twice. Then a third time, slowly, the way she read things when something felt wrong without her being able to immediately name the wrongness. It was past the 8th bell. The outer stables were beyond the main courtyard, in the service yard abutting the palace's eastern wall. Linen deliveries did not come through the stables. They came through the southern receiving entrance, which was specifically designed for that purpose and staffed accordingly. She folded the note and set it on the desk. Her wolf, restless for weeks in the particular way of an animal relearning what it had been kept from, went very still. She could stay in her room, send word that the order had not reached her in time. It would be believed by some and not others. Or she could go. She had spent 10 years staying in her room in one form or another. She pulled on her heaviest cloak and went. The outer stables were quiet in the way that places were quiet when they should not be. The lanterns along the service yard wall burned, casting long shapes across the stone, and the smell of horses was everywhere. But the animals themselves were still. Too still. Horses that had lived in working stables for years did not go quiet without reason. She stopped at the entrance to the main corridor and listened. 3 men. She could identify them without seeing them, the specific quality of deliberate stillness, people trying to occupy space without announcing it. Her wolf registered it before she had finished processing the sound. She took 3 steps back. They were faster. The first came from the gap between the stable wall and the tack room, moving with the speed of someone who had done this before. She dropped below his reach and felt his hand catch the edge of her cloak rather than her shoulder. The half-second it bought her was enough to turn. Except there was a second man at the yard entrance, and a third from the right. And the arrangement was suddenly very clear. They had placed themselves well. This had been planned by someone who understood how to close a space. Her wolf came forward without waiting. It came the way it had been held back for years, all at once, with the accumulated force of everything suppressed for too long. Her bones broke and reformed before she had fully decided to let them. Her spine bent in ways human spines did not, the muscles of her back tearing and rebuilding in seconds with pain that was massive and brief, and then replaced by something else entirely. Her cloak fell away. The stable yard sharpened, the darkness resolving into gradients of gray and gold that human eyes could not access. She was smaller than she had once been. She knew that in the abstract way, she knew most things about her wolf, from a distance, without direct experience. Years without shifting, without running, without the use that kept a wolf's condition. The form she occupied was lean past functional into gaunt, with the particular economy of something that had survived rather than lived. But she was fast. The first man had not expected the shift. None of them had, which told her something useful. The man nearest to her stumbled back when she cleared the distance in a single movement, and she gave him a reason to stay down before launching off his chest and putting 10 feet between herself and the second. The third circled. She turned to track all 3, her paws finding the uneven stone with the uncertainty of something relearning its own footing. Then something happened in her chest. Not the mark warming as it did when Edric was nearby. A rupture, something tearing open and flooding through with the specific quality of a wolf that had moved from awareness into action, aimed at her location with the total, consuming focus of an animal that had decided nothing in its way mattered. She had seconds to understand what that meant before he arrived. Edric came over the eastern wall, not through the gate. Over the wall. She heard him land in the service yard before she saw him. The impact of something large and not entirely human hitting stone. Then he was in the lantern light, and the shift was not complete. He was between forms in the way that powerful wolves sometimes were when the animal had moved faster than the man intended. Too broad through the shoulders, the hands not entirely hands, his eyes lit in the dark with something that had nothing to do with the lanterns. The controlled quality she had come to associate with him was entirely absent. What occupied the yard with her instead was something considerably older. The 3 men looked at him for approximately 2 seconds before deciding that no arrangement of coin was adequate. They left. The yard went still. The horses remained motionless. Hilda stood in the center of the service yard in her wolf form and watched Edric pull himself back into the shape of a man. The shoulders settling, the hands resolving, the illumination fading from his eyes. It took longer than it should have. His wolf was reluctant to fully yield the ground it had taken. She understood that reluctance more than she wanted to. She shifted back, worse in reverse, the body reassembling itself from something certain and instinctive into the more complicated arrangement of a human, the heightened senses dimming like moving from a lit room to a dark one. Her legs held, barely. She was breathing harder than the physical effort fully accounted for. Edric crossed the yard toward her. She put a hand up. "I am standing. Do not make it into more than it is." He stopped at a distance she had indicated without specifying. He was looking at her with the expression she had been assembling an understanding of over several weeks, stripped of its public layer, without the performance that went with the title. "You shifted," he said. "I noticed. Your wolf. I know what my wolf looks like." She retrieved the fallen cloak from near the wall. The cold had not bothered her 30 seconds ago. "Someone sent me here deliberately. The assignment was fabricated." "I know." His jaw was tight. "I felt the bond change before any message reached me. I felt you." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked away. "You came over the wall. The gate was taking too long." She had nothing to say to that, which was its own kind of information. She filed it carefully and said nothing. It took 3 days. 2 of the hired men were located by the palace guard before morning. They had not traveled far, which suggested they had not planned for an escape route. Under questioning, both named their contact, a household agent in the employ of House Vane. The trail from there required less effort than it might have, because Seraphine's operation had been built for discretion rather than durability. Edric came to Hilda's chamber on the 3rd evening and laid out what had been uncovered without softening any of it. Private correspondence between Aldous and Seraphine's father. 30 years of it. Specific instructions for the removal of targeted archive records. Not a general purge, but a surgical extraction, focused on one family name, one land grant, one lineage designation. The letters explained the reason plainly. The founding period bloodline had been identified as a threat to the family's ambitions toward the throne long before Seraphine was born. Aldous had not acted from conviction. He had been acquired the way useful men were acquired, gradually with resources, until his interests and theirs became indistinguishable. Hilda listened from the chair by the window, without interrupting. When Edric finished, she stood and went to the desk and opened the tin box. She removed the folded notations from the archive, the land title fragment, the lineage designation, the page reference for the founding period records. She set them in front of him. "Osric confirmed the connection before the attack," she said. "I did not bring it to you because I did not yet know what you would do with it." He looked at the documents for a long time, then at her. "And now? Now I know what Seraphine will do next." Her wolf had stopped pacing. It sat at the back of her chest with the quality of an animal that had identified the terrain it was operating in, oriented and still. She had not reached toward it since the stable yard. She had also stopped fighting it, which means I know what has to happen before she does it. She picked up her own notation from the archive, the page reference she had set aside separately from the lineage documents. "There is a legal instrument I found in the archive the week before the attack." Osric located the reference. "I need to explain it to you now, because once it is invoked, the sequence cannot be interrupted." Edric pulled the chair from the other side of the desk and sat across from her, without ceremony, the way a man sat when he intended to listen. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Seraphine moved on the 26th night. Hilda knew it was coming. She had said as much to Edric 4 nights earlier, when she had laid out the sequence for him. What Seraphine would calculate, what she would decide, and in what order. The lineage documents were the threat. The archive was where the threat lived. Seraphine was precise, and precise people did not leave threats standing when they had identified a window for removal. The window, as Hilda had assessed it, was narrow. The palace guard's attention had been redirected toward the investigation of the stable-yard attack. The archive sat in the northern wing, which saw less overnight traffic than any other occupied section of the palace. Osric had 1 assistant and no dedicated overnight staff. The combination was not an accident of circumstance. It had been allowed to develop that way, over time, by people who understood that an unguarded archive was an archive with controllable contents. What Seraphine did not know was that Osric had spent 3 days doing something about it. He had not been asked to. He had not informed anyone. He had simply, with the methodical instinct of a man whose entire function was the preservation of records, begun logging visitors to the archive and sealing the most relevant volumes in the secondary storage room to which only he held the key. He had also arranged with the overnight hall steward a protocol. 3 knocks on the archive interior door meant summon the guard, no questions required. Hilda had discovered this on the morning after she and Edric had spoken, when she returned to the archive to confirm the land title documentation. Osric had mentioned it with the same tone he used to describe the indexing system. "You prepared for this," she had said. "I have been an archivist in this palace for 22 years, he had replied. "People have attempted to alter records before. The method changes. The intention does not." The guard arrived at the archive door at the second bell of the 26th night to find Seraphine's personal steward with a lantern, a set of copied keys that should not have existed, and 2 cases of materials he had clearly not arrived with. Osric was inside the secondary storage room with the sealed volumes and a bruised forearm from where the steward had shoved him against the shelving when he had refused to open the secondary lock. Seraphine herself was not present. She had not come in person. Of course she had not. But the steward had been in her direct employ for 11 years, and the copied keys traced to a locksmith in the lower city who, under questioning, remembered the commission clearly. By dawn, the connection was documented. Seraphine was confined to her chambers before the morning bell. Aldous, informed of the development, went very quiet in the way that men went quiet when they were calculating how much of a wall remained standing and whether it was worth defending. Hilda submitted the formal invocation before the second bell had finished. It was a single page. The legal citation, the case reference from the archive volume Osric had identified, the nature of the accusation that had been entered before the council on the 5th day. The original espionage charge had been dismissed but never formally withdrawn, which meant it remained as entered. That was the trigger. She had written it out 3 times in the preceding days until the language was clean and unambiguous, and she walked it to the council secretary's office herself. The secretary read it twice, looked at her, and read it a 3rd time. "The open judgment laws have not been invoked in—" "I am aware of when they were last invoked," Hilda said. "Please confirm the filing." He confirmed it. Aldous attempted to have the filing set aside before midday on the grounds that the original accusation had been substantively dismissed and therefore carried no legal standing to trigger the provision. The argument was technically coherent and arrived in front of the junior council adjudicator within 2 hours of the filing. Edric ended the argument by the 3rd hour with a document of his own, a formal confirmation that the original accusation remained in the council record as entered, unsigned, and unresolved, which was accurate because no one had thought to formally close it when dismissing it verbally. The gap was small. It held. The open judgment convened at noon. The judgment yard was an outdoor space at the palace's northern face, used historically for pack gatherings that the interior halls could not contain. Stone tiers rose on 3 sides, open to the sky above. The assembled Alpha Lords who had remained in the capital since the ritual filled those tiers. Some who had sent for their retinues to depart and recalled them when word of the events spread, some who had never left. Hilda stood in the center of the yard. She had dressed that morning with the same attention she had given the altar cloth 11 days before the ritual. Not for the occasion, but because deliberate action was how she inhabited her own life. Her hair was braided and pinned. Her clothes were clean and well-fitted and were not silk and did not need to be. The mark at her neck was visible. Osric presented first. He spoke with the specificity of a man who understood that records were arguments and that the argument was only as strong as its documentation. He described the land title fragment. He described the founding period registry. He described the lineage designation and the 2 generational connections that led from the partial name on the fragment to one of the original founding houses of the kingdom. He described the structural absence in the public archive, the gap where records had been, the margins of adjacent documents that referenced materials no longer present in the files they were supposed to occupy. He presented the correspondence between Aldous and Seraphine's father. He presented the locksmith's testimony regarding the copied keys. He presented the account of the overnight guard regarding the state of the secondary storage room and the bruising on his own forearm, offered matter-of-factly and without theatrical emphasis. When Osric finished, the yard was quiet in the way that spaces went quiet when the people in them were processing something they could not immediately dismiss. Aldous was questioned next. He had been calculating for hours. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. The particular arrangement of a man who had been working out which version of events cost him least. She had spent enough time watching people manage difficult truths to recognize when someone had settled on a number. He confirmed the destruction of the records. Not fully, not with detail, not with the admission of a man who had decided honesty was valuable. But the combination of the correspondence and the archive's documented absences left him with a version of denial that the assembled lords could evaluate for themselves, and they did, and the confirmation that came from their evaluation had the weight that collective judgment carried in a room full of people who governed by reading other people accurately. The founding period lineage designation was ruled valid by two of the senior lords present, independent of each other, based on the documentation Osric had presented. A third abstained. None contested it. Seraphine was brought forward last. She had maintained her composure through the morning hours. Hilda had been told as much by the guard assigned to her chambers, who had found her dressed and seated and disinclined to speak. She maintained it now, standing in the judgment yard with the same structural quality she had carried at the ritual, the performance that had become indistinguishable from the person. The gap appeared only once. When Osric read the specific passage from her father's correspondence, the passage describing the lineage research, the identification of Hilda's mother's family, the decision to eliminate the threat before it could become a complication, something moved across Seraphine's face. Not guilt, not fear. The specific expression of a person watching a calculation they had believed sound reveal its central flaw in public, with no mechanism available to correct it. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then it was gone. It had been seen by everyone present. The rulings were delivered in the traditional order: status, then title, then consequence. Seraphine's noble lineage was formally stripped. House Vane was dissolved as a recognized pack-holding. She was given 48 hours and a guarded escort to the kingdom's southern border. What she carried with her was subject to inventory. Aldous was removed from the council with immediate effect, stripped of all titles and land grants held through royal appointment. He was permitted to remain within the kingdom's borders, which was the minimum mercy the law required and the maximum his conduct warranted. The proceedings closed at the 4th bell. The Alpha Lords descended from the tiers in clusters, speaking among themselves in the particular register of people who had witnessed something they would be explaining for years. Hilda stood in the center of the yard as the space emptied around her and waited. Edric descended last. He crossed the yard without ceremony and stood before her with the direct, undeflected quality she had come to understand as his natural register when there was no audience worth performing for. The afternoon light caught the scar along his jaw. "I would like to speak plainly," he said. "You may." He held her gaze. "What I said 10 years ago in this palace was not what my wolf would have said. That is not an excuse. There is no arrangement of words that functions as an excuse for it. But you should know that it was a choice I made against the pull of an instinct I had not yet learned to account for, because I had been taught to govern with my reason and not with what I was." He paused. "I have been trying to determine what the correct thing is to say to you about that for approximately 18 days. I do not believe there is a correct thing. There is only the truth of it, and whether you find it worth anything is not mine to decide." The mark at her neck pulsed once, deeply, with the warmth of something that had been waiting to be acknowledged. Around them, the remaining lords who had not yet departed the yard went still. She felt it before she understood it. The collective attention of every experienced alpha in the space, orienting toward the center of the yard, drawn by something they could perceive without being told what they were perceiving. The bond moved between her and Edric like a visible current, like heat above stone in summer, and the men and women who had spent their lives learning to read the signs of a genuine mate bond read it plainly. No fabricated mark produced that. Every person in the yard knew it. Hilda breathed. Her wolf sat in her chest, fully present for the first time in 10 years, and waited with her. "I am not making a decision today," she said. "I know. I am not making one tomorrow either. I know that too. She looked at him for a moment longer. 10 years of distance, reduced overnight to the length of a yard. The weight of a word he had spoken to a woman who had braided her hair twice and walked 12 miles to stand in front of him. The mark that had not asked for her permission. The wolf that had chosen anyway, twice, a decade apart. I will let you know, she said, when I have decided. She left the judgment yard through the northern gate into the late afternoon cold and walked back into the palace alone. 3 months later, the court began referring to her differently. Not because she had been proclaimed, not because a ceremony had been performed, or a declaration issued, or a document signed before the council, but because she had walked into the judgment yard with nothing but archive notations and a bruised archivist and an uncontested lineage, and walked out with every hostile hand in the palace removed, and the court had an accurate instinct for where power actually resided, regardless of what titles had been formally distributed. She still reported to the linen stores on the morning she chose to. Osric had moved the founding period lineage records to the primary archive, properly filed and indexed, where they would remain accessible to anyone with cause to consult them. The mark had stopped feeling like a weight. Her wolf had not gone quiet again. She had stopped asking it to.